The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park. I could hear the laughter of children blending with the chirping of birds, creating a symphony of joy that wrapped around me and Carl as we played. My heart swelled with pride as I watched him chase after the frisbee, his laughter ringing like music in my ears. He seemed to be in his own world, a universe where the colors were brighter and the sounds more vivid. "Carl, catch!" I called out, tossing the frisbee high into the air. He tracked its flight with his bright eyes, his face lit up with pure excitement. As he leaped to snatch it from the air, a wide smile broke across his face. It was moments like this that reminded me of the beauty of our bond, a connection that transcended words and understanding. "Got it, Dad," he exclaimed, holding the frisbee triumphantly over his head, his joy infectious. "Of course you did. You're a superstar." I couldn't help but laugh, my heart aching with love for this incredible boy. I admired how he found joy in the simplest of things, how he could lose himself in the moment, completely unbothered by the world around him. As we continued to play, I reflected on our journey together. I remembered the long nights filled with uncertainty during the adoption process, the fear of not being enough for him, of not truly understanding his needs. Each hurdle had been daunting, but the love I felt for Carl propelled me forward. I was determined to create a safe haven for him, a place where he could thrive, free from judgment and prejudice. "Do you remember the first time we went to the zoo?" I asked, catching my breath after another round of frisbee. Carl paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Lions!" he finally shouted, his eyes lighting up once more. "Yes, the lions! You were so excited to see them. You kept roaring like one." I chuckled, the memory washing over me like a warm breeze. "You even made all the other kids laugh." "Roar!" he mimicked, throwing his arms wide as if he were a lion himself. I watched him with a mixture of admiration and sadness. The world could be a harsh place, and I often worried about how people would perceive him, how they would perceive us. I wanted to shield him from the judgments and biases that lurk just beneath the surface of society. Just then, I noticed a woman walking towards us. She appeared to be in her late 50s, her expression serious as she approached. My heart skipped a beat. I could sense a shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere that made me instinctively protective. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp as she halted a few feet away. "Are you the boy's father?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Yes, I am. Is there something I can help you with?" Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized me. "Are you sure? It looks like you're with him, but I just can't shake the feeling that something isn't right here." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Ma'am, Carl is my adopted son. We're just enjoying a day at the park." She crossed her arms, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. "Adopted? How do I know you're telling the truth?" Carl, sensing the tension, stepped back slightly, his eyes darting between us. "Dad," he murmured, confusion clouding his innocent face. "Everything's okay, buddy," I assured him, but I could feel the weight of the woman's gaze bearing down on me. "I don't mean to be rude," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "but I've seen enough to know when something feels off. I think you might be kidnapping him." The accusation hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and disorienting. My heart sank and I felt anger rising within me. Anger not just for myself, but for Carl, who was now pulled into this storm of misunderstanding. "You don't understand," I pleaded, my voice steady but strained. "Carl is my son. I love him more than anything." But she shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I'm calling the police." In that moment, time seemed to freeze. I glanced at Carl, whose eyes were wide with confusion, and I felt a surge of helplessness wash over me. How could someone look at us and not see the love that bound us together? How could she not understand that family isn't defined solely by blood? Please, I urged, desperation creeping into my voice. Just give me a chance to explain. But as I spoke, I could see her reaching for her phone, and I knew deep down that our peaceful day at the park was unraveling before us. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, like the dark clouds that often loom before a storm. "What are you talking about?" I managed to ask, my voice a mix of confusion and rising anger. Margaret stood there, arms crossed, her expression a blend of disbelief and accusation. The park, once a haven of laughter and joy, seemed to close in around us, the laughter of children fading into an unsettling silence. "Look at you. How can you possibly be his father?" Margaret's voice was sharp, her words cutting through the air like a serrated knife. I glanced at Carl, who had instinctively retreated a few steps behind me, his gaze fixed on the ground. I could see the confusion etched on his face, the way his brow furrowed, and how he clutched his favorite toy, a small green dinosaur, tightly against his chest. He often did this when the world became overwhelming. "Ma'am, I assure you, Carl is my son. I adopted him after—" I began. But she cut me off, her voice tinged with indignation. "Adopted? Or kidnapped?" Her words felt like a slap. "You think I'm going to stand by and let you take him? I'm calling the police." The weight of her accusation hit me hard, and I felt a surge of helplessness wash over me. It wasn't just the fear of the police arriving that made my stomach churn. It was the realization that, despite my love for Carl and the bond we shared, I was being painted as a villain in her eyes simply because of the color of my skin. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure as rage and despair battled within me. "Please, just listen to me," I pleaded, my voice steadier than I felt. "Carl is my son. He was placed in my care because he needed a loving home. He has autism, and sometimes he struggles to communicate, but that doesn't make our bond any less real." Margaret's expression didn't change. It was as if she had built a wall around herself, impervious to reason. "I don't believe you," she insisted, her voice rising. "My instincts tell me something is off. I'm not letting you take him anywhere until I know for sure." Carl fidgeted beside me, his fingers twitching as he began to rock slightly back and forth, a sign that he was overwhelmed. I knelt down beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Carl, buddy, it's okay. Just breathe. I'm here," I said softly, trying to ground him in the chaos that surrounded us. "I want to go home," he murmured, his voice barely audible, and my heart ached at the fear that colored his words. "Not yet, Carl, just a little longer. We'll get through this together," I promised, though I wasn't sure how. I turned back to Margaret, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You're not helping him by accusing me. All you're doing is making it worse." She raised her phone, her fingers poised to dial. "I'm calling the cops. They'll sort this out." "You don't understand what you're doing," I exclaimed, desperation creeping into my tone. "This is not just a misunderstanding. This is my life and my son you're putting at risk." But Margaret didn't seem to hear me. Her focus was on the screen of her phone, and I could see her thumb hovering over the call button. I felt a wave of panic rise within me, the thought of police involvement sending a chill down my spine. I had worked so hard to create a safe space for Carl, and now it felt like that fragile world was crumbling around us. As the seconds ticked by, time seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. I could feel the weight of Margaret's accusation bearing down on me, and for the first time since we had arrived at the park, I felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping in. Would anyone believe me? Would they see me as the father I was, or merely a threat? "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Just give me a chance to explain." The sharp sound of sirens sliced through the air, and my heart raced as I saw the police car pull up to the park. My stomach churned with anxiety as two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure in front of Carl, who still seemed bewildered by the chaos surrounding us. I knelt beside him, trying to create a barrier between him and the escalating situation. "Hey, buddy," I said gently, brushing his hair back. "It's okay. Just some people who want to help." I tried to sound reassuring, but the knot in my throat made it difficult. I could see the worry in Carl's eyes, and it hurt to think that he might be scared because of me. As the officers approached, I stood, forcing myself to meet their gaze with a calm demeanor. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm Thomas, and this is my son, Carl." "Sir," one officer replied, his tone serious but not unfriendly. "We received a call about a potential kidnapping. Can you explain the situation?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. "Carl is my adopted son. He has autism, and we were just enjoying a day out together." I gestured towards the frisbee lying on the grass. "We've been playing and having fun." The other officer, a woman with kind eyes, glanced at Carl. He was fidgeting, his gaze fixed on the ground. I could see he was starting to stim, his fingers tapping against his leg in a rhythmic motion. Panic surged through me. I had always been so careful to protect Carl from misunderstandings, and here we were, in the middle of a nightmare. "Carl, look at me," I urged softly, kneeling beside him again. "You're safe. Just breathe with me, okay?" I demonstrated, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly. He followed my lead, but I could see the confusion etched on his face. The officers exchanged glances, and I could sense their uncertainty. "Is there any documentation you can show us?" the first officer asked, his tone softening a bit. "Yes, I have the adoption papers in my bag," I replied, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. I turned to grab my backpack, but before I could reach it, I noticed Carl's stimming escalating. He was now rocking slightly, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Carl, buddy, it's okay," I murmured, feeling a surge of desperation. "Focus on my voice. You're doing great." I wanted to reach out and hold him, but I feared that would only draw more attention. "Hey, little man," the female officer said gently, kneeling down to Carl's level. "Can you tell me your name?" Her voice was soothing, and I could see Carl hesitating, his fingers twitching. "Carl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's a great name, Carl. Can you tell me how old you are?" She continued to speak to him with patience, and I felt a flicker of hope. 10. Carl mumbled, his gaze flickering towards me, seeking reassurance. I nodded encouragingly, my heart aching for the misunderstanding that had led us here. Margaret stood a few feet away, her eyes darting between the officers and us. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the realization of her actions beginning to dawn on her. The tension was palpable as the officers remained vigilant, assessing the situation. "Thomas," the male officer said, returning his focus to me, "can you explain why she thought you had kidnapped him?" I took a deep breath, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice tinged with frustration. "I guess she saw a black man with a white child and jumped to conclusions. It's a sad reality." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her previous conviction waning. I didn't mean to imply anything, she stuttered, her voice trembling. I just saw something that looked wrong. Look wrong, I echoed, disbelief flooding my words. This is my son. He's not a possession. He's my whole life. The officers looked between us, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on all of us. I could feel Carl's distress, and the desire to protect him surge within me. I wanted to scream, to make her understand the love I had for this child, my child. Please, just give me a moment, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I need to help Carl. I turned back to him, focusing all my energy on calming my son, hoping that the officers would recognize the love between us, not the color of our skin. The air felt thick with tension as I stood there, my heart racing, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that had unfolded in mere moments. The police officers were now assessing the situation, their eyes darting between me, Carl, and Margaret. I could see that Margaret was still on edge, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. But my focus shifted to one of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes, who crouched down to Carl's level. Hey there, buddy, he said softly, his voice gentle and inviting. Can you tell me your name? Carl looked up, his eyes wide, and I held my breath, hoping he would respond. After a moment of hesitation, he blinked rapidly, a sign that he was processing the interaction. Carl, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's a great name, Carl. Can you tell me what you like to do? The officer continued, unperturbed by Carl's quietness. I watched in awe as the officer patiently engaged with my son, recognizing the importance of communication on Carl's terms. Carl's fingers began to twiddle with the hem of his shirt, a familiar stimming behavior, but there was a hint of a smile on his face, too. I like to throw frisbees, he said, his eyes lighting up a little as he remembered our earlier activities. The officer nodded, encouraging him further. Frisbees are fun. Do you have a favorite place to throw them? Carl's gaze drifted to the grassy field where we had been playing. At the park, he replied, a bit more confidently now. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I saw Carl slowly opening up. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt monumental. I stepped closer, wanting to reassure him, to let him know that everything would be all right. Carl, it's okay, buddy, I said, crouching down beside him. You're safe. I'm right here with you. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. Daddy, are we in trouble? No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. Just some people are confused, but I promise you, everything is going to be all right. Margaret stood a few feet away, her expression shifting as she overheard our exchange. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the realization of her hasty judgment creeping in. I could only imagine what she was thinking, but part of me wanted her to understand. Do you have a frisbee? The officer asked Carl, gently steering the conversation. Carl shook his head. I lost it. Maybe we can get you a new one later, the officer said, smiling warmly. How does that sound? Carl's face brightened, and I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Okay. As the officer continued to engage with Carl, I couldn't help but glance over at Margaret. Her demeanor had softened, and I wondered if she was beginning to question her own biases. I'm sorry, she finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't know. I took a deep breath, the frustration bubbling inside me. You thought I was kidnapping him? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. You saw a black man with a white child and jumped to conclusions. I know, and I'm sorry. She stammered, her eyes darting down as if the ground might swallow her whole. I didn't mean to. I just reacted. Reactions can have consequences, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You have to understand, this isn't just about you being concerned for a child. This is about the prejudice I face every day. She looked at me, really looked, as if she were trying to see beneath the surface. I can't imagine what that must be like, she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. Carl, still engaged with the officer, seemed oblivious to the tension between us. I admired his ability to navigate his world with such innocence, even in the face of chaos. The officer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up and turned to me. "Sir, I think it's important for us to verify your relationship with Carl. Can you provide any documentation?" I nodded, my heart racing at the thought of having to prove my love for my son to a stranger. "Yes, I have the adoption papers in my bag." As I turned to retrieve them, I could feel Margaret's gaze on me, heavy with the weight of her earlier actions. The air between us was thick with unspoken apologies and a burgeoning understanding. I silently hoped this moment would spark a change, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever misjudged someone based on the color of their skin. Gathering the papers, I took a deep breath, preparing to share my truth once again. As I stood there, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders, the officer regarded me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I think it would be best to contact social services to verify the relationship between you and Carl," he suggested gently, his voice steady and calm. I could feel Margaret's gaze burning into the side of my face, her expression shifting from suspicion to something resembling regret. "Social services?" I echoed, the bitterness creeping into my voice. "You think I can't even keep my son safe? That I'm some kind of criminal?" My heart raced as I fought against the emotional tide threatening to overwhelm me. Carl was still standing close, his brow furrowed in confusion, and I wanted nothing more than to shield him from this chaos. Margaret's face paled, and I could see the internal struggle written all over her features. "I never meant for it to come to this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I was scared." "Scared?" I couldn't help but let out a harsh laugh, though it felt more like a sob. "Scared of what? A black man with his son? That's what this is about, isn't it?" The bitterness of my words hung heavily in the air, laced with the painful truths of my lived experiences. I didn't know," she stammered, her hands wringing together nervously. "I saw you two, and my instincts just took over. I thought—" "What did you think?" I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "That I was abducting him? That I was a monster?" "I thought he might be in danger," she replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't know you were his father." Just then, the sound of sirens in the distance interrupted our exchange. Social services arrived shortly after. Their presence felt like a storm cloud rolling in to overshadow the sun. I pulled out the adoption papers, my hands shaking as I presented them to the officers. "Here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is my proof. I've worked hard to give Carl a loving home." The officers scrutinized the documents, while other social workers began to engage with Carl in a gentle manner, kneeling down to his level. I watched as Carl's anxiety eased slightly. They spoke to him softly, recognizing his unique way of communicating. I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would understand him. As I looked back at Margaret, I saw her expression shift again. She was no longer the woman who confronted me with accusations. She now appeared deeply conflicted. I just wanted to protect my family," she confessed, her voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "Your family?" I questioned, the confusion evident in my voice. "What do you mean?" I'm Carl's biological grandmother, she finally admitted, her voice cracking. The revelation hung in the air, palpable and shocking. My heart raced as I processed her words. A moment of silence enveloped us, the gravity of the situation settling heavily over the small crowd that had gathered. "Are you serious?" I managed to say, disbelief coloring my tone. "You're telling me that you're his grandmother? How could you not know? How could you not recognize him?" Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Carl, who was still watching the interaction, his brow furrowed. "I lost my son years ago, and I never thought I'd see my grandchild like this," she murmured, the pain evident in her voice. "I never got to see him grow up, and when I saw you with him, I panicked. I felt the anger within me begin to dissolve, the sharp edges blurring as the reality of our intertwined lives sank in. You don't know what it's like to be judged by the color of your skin," I said quietly, reflecting on my own experiences. "But I can't deny that this changes everything." The officers exchanged glances, the tension in the air slowly dissipating as they processed the unexpected turn of events. I could see that realization was dawning on them as well. Margaret's facade was crumbling, and she was no longer just an antagonist in this story. She was a part of Carl's life, whether she liked it or not. "Carl needs love and understanding," I said, my voice steadier now. "We all do." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at Carl, who was still processing the whirlwind of emotions around him. In that moment, under the bright sun, amidst the chaos of misunderstanding, we stood on the precipice of something new, a path forward that neither of us had anticipated, but one that had the potential to heal wounds and bridge gaps. As I took a deep breath, I felt the weight of the world shift, if only slightly, and hoped that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this complicated new reality together. As the air began to still around us, I watched Margaret approach with hesitant steps, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, yet there was a flicker of hope igniting in the pit of my stomach. I could see the remorse etched in her features, and for the first time I noticed the vulnerability behind her skepticism. "Thomas," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I'm so sorry. I never should have assumed. I thought I was protecting my grandson." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the burden of their implications. "Your grandson," I echoed, my heart racing. The realization of her relationship to Carl flooded my mind, a startling twist in a day already filled with chaos. "You're Carl's biological grandmother?" "Yes," she admitted, wiping away a single tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I lost my son years ago. I never had a chance to know Carl. I've been trying to cope with the loss, and when I saw you with him," she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the ground, "and I thought I was protecting him from a stranger." I took a deep breath, the anger I had felt moments ago softening into a cautious understanding. "Margaret, I understand that you were scared. But Carl is my son. I love him more than anything in this world." My voice was steady, but the tremor of emotion was palpable. She nodded, her expression one of both shame and recognition, and I could see her begin to process the layers of her past and present colliding. I didn't know. I didn't know he had a father who loves him. I was so caught up in my own grief that I didn't stop to think about what I was doing. "None of us are perfect," I replied, feeling a strange kinship with her in that moment. "We all make mistakes, but what matters now is how we move forward." I glanced over at Carl, who was still standing quietly by my side, his fingers dancing nervously on the fabric of his shirt. He needs us both. Margaret's eyes flicked to Carl, and I could see the flicker of recognition dawning in her gaze. I want to be part of his life, she said, her voice firming with determination. I want to make up for lost time. Carl took a step closer to me, seeking reassurance, and I bent down to his level. Hey, buddy, I said softly, feeling the warmth of his small hand slip into mine. It's okay. We're just talking about some family stuff. Family? He asked, tilting his head in confusion, a hint of curiosity breaking through the uncertainty that had clouded him. Yeah, Carl. Family, I replied, smiling at him. It can be complicated, but it's about love and support, right? And look, this is your grandma. I gestured to Margaret, who now wore a gentle smile, her expression softened by the moment. Grandma? Carl echoed, his eyes widening as he processed the word. Slowly, he stepped forward, uncertainty still lingering in his gaze. Hi, Grandma. Hi, sweet boy, she said, her voice breaking slightly as she knelt down to his level. I'm so happy to finally meet you. I've missed so much already. In that moment, I could see the walls beginning to crumble between them, the tentative bond of family starting to weave itself anew. Can we do this together? Margaret asked, her eyes pleading for my acceptance. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision resting heavily on my shoulders. But as I looked at Carl, I realized that this was not just about us as individuals. It was about him. Yes, I finally replied, the word escaping my lips like a long-held breath. Let's work together for Carl. A look of relief washed over Margaret's face, and I felt a warmth spread within me. Wendy, my partner, stepped forward, her presence a grounding force. I think it's a wonderful idea, she said, her voice soothing. We can all be a part of Carl's life, and together we can build something beautiful. As we stood together, the four of us, Margaret, Carl, Wendy, and I felt the air shift. The tension that had once filled the space was replaced by a sense of unity, a promise of love and acceptance. Margaret's journey of grief and misunderstanding was beginning to intertwine with ours, and together we could navigate the complexities of family. Let's make a plan, I said, feeling a surge of optimism. We can start by spending more time together, learning about each other. Yes, I'd like that, Margaret replied, her voice stronger now. I want to be here for Carl and for you, Thomas. I want to understand. And as the sun began to set behind us, casting a golden hue over our little gathering, I felt a profound sense of hope blossom